Good morning. Happy Monday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. All right. Happy National Batman Day. So I think DC Comics celebrated on the 19th over the weekend. But, excuse me. But I think I also have some information that today is the official National Batman Day. So we're going to celebrate that today if it's okay with you. And then again, isn't every day Batman Day. So in celebration, let's do a Q&A. It appears to be a very simple question, but we're going to dig into it a little bit and maybe get a little bit more depth of understanding about a couple of concepts. So this comes from Mihail, and Mihail says, could you please explain how to improve hip abduction, so ABduction, for wide ISA with very tight adductors? Okay. So right away, you kind of hit on one of my pet peeves there, Mihail. It's this concept of tight. So tight is a sensation. We need to recognize it as such. So it's not a representative property of muscle. So when somebody says that something is tight, we don't know if it's eccentrically oriented and producing tension or concentrically oriented and producing tension. And so unless we want to fall into the traps of the stretch and strengthen crowd, we got to be very, very careful when we use a representation or a concept like tight. So what we want to do is we want to look at it from the concentric to eccentric orientation. So that represents the position and is much more useful. So based on your description, if we have limited hip abduction, we're going to have concentric orientation of the musculature that is limiting that abduction. So let's start using these concepts a little bit more effectively. Now, you also mentioned wide ISA. So when I put together the concepts of the wide and the narrow archetypes, people looked at ISAs forever. They looked at structure, but what I did is I followed one very simple rule, and that is that the structure is going to determine the strategy. So when we have a wide ISA with limited extremity ranges of motion, then I know I'm in the midst of a compensatory strategy, and because of the wide ISA, I know that the bias is going to be an exhalation bias. Now, assuming my client or patient is still alive, then they're still breathing, which means that they have to use a compensatory strategy. So under these circumstances, if I need to restore range of motion and I have a bias towards exhalation, which is the bias of the wide ISA, then the simplest answer they could possibly give you to restore hip abduction is that I need to restore a non-compensatory inhalation. But we might have to construct that. So there's a couple of things that we want to recognize about our wide ISAs. Okay, so if I grab Fred here, so Fred's actually got a pretty wide ISA, so your infrasternal angle is going to be right there. But one of the properties, when I have an exhalation bias, I have to look at the pelvis because we're talking about hips. And so with the bias of the wide ISA, I'm going to have a nutated sacrum, I have a concentrically oriented pelvic outlet, and then I'm going to have a wide IPA as well. So my goal to restore the hip abduction, which is actually an external rotation measure, is to be able to close this IPA, which is representative of a non-compensatory inhalation. Now, so right away, what I should recognize about the first compensatory strategy, which is a diaphragm compensation in the wide ISA. So I have a diaphragm that's going to move against the axial skeleton to allow me to breathe in. I get this wide IPA, which means I'm going to have a limitation in abduction right off the bat because I'm going to increase the concentric orientation of that musculature, which promotes internal rotation of the hip. So remember, my wide ISAs are biased towards internal rotation, which for those traditionalists, it's going to also allow that adduction to occur. Now, the one thing that you're going to have to pay attention to is, do I have any other compensatory strategies superimposed? So if I get a posterior compression at the base of the sacrum, if I have any anterior orientation, I'm going to pick up even more concentric orientation of the musculature that's going to limit my external rotation measures. And so you're going to have to pay attention to that. So if I do have any anterior orientation, dead giveaway is going to be a loss of ER at the hip as well. What I have to do is I'm going to have to reorient that pelvis first. So So I gotta recapture the ability to posterior orient. So that's going to be hip extension activities, because I got to bring that ischial tuberosity. I'm going to bring this ischial tuberosity closer to the femur. So I got to bring it this way. And the way I'm going to do that, again, is with hip extension activities. My preference would be to do something unilateral under these circumstances, because if we do bilateral hip extension activities, there's a concern that we're going to create that posterior lower compressive strategy, and then that we just created more interference for our ability to try to recapture a normal movement. So it could be something as simple as some form of glute bridging, and as we advance people through these hip extension type activities, we can look at arm bar variations that are going to promote this hip extension. As we get people to standing up, then we're looking at some variation of like a sprinter step up or a crossover step up at the much more advanced level. We want to achieve an effective exhalation. So first and foremost, we've got to get the ISA to move. So we need a dynamic ISA. So what that means is that the diaphragm is now able to move from its compensatory concentric orientation to a normal eccentric orientation. So that's what an effective exhalation is, and this is representative of an ISA that will move. And so when we do our ISA test, just look at the YouTube video that I have posted. When you do your ISA test, we should restore dynamic movement of that, and then you should also see a restoration of some of your extremity motion. If we need shape change to promote this dynamic ISA, so Fred here's a really good representation because he's pretty wide and he's also flat front to back. So if you got somebody that looks like that, you might need to do some form of axial rolling. So again, arm bars come back onto the table, side lying activities to help promote this anterior posterior expansion. So we're going to take advantage of gravity to help us expand this thorax anterior to posterior. If we're assuming that we don't have this posterior lower compression that I was talking about before, so this would be concentric orientation below the level of the trochanter, we've immediately got that 0 to 60 range that's available to us in the thorax and in the pelvis. So we can start to do reaches within that range. We can work on dorsal rostral expansion activities within that range. We can even go into the gym. We can do some staggered stance, high to low cable pressing, and some limited range chopping variations that will allow us to create the posterior expansion to achieve the normal non-compensatory inhalation strategy. We've got oblique sitting that we can use. So that's a nice unilateral activity that's going to help promote the shape change through the thorax. And then we can even move forward towards like a heels elevated split squat variation, again, as we get into higher level activities. Now, if we have normal internal rotations, that immediately buys us 60 more degrees of activity. So now we've got reaches up to 120 degrees, and we've got full depth almost on all of our split stance activities. So now we have upward reaches. So we have pullover variations that are on the table. We've got straight arm cable pull down variations, and even a downward dog if you can get to that. We've got full range chops now available to us, and we can add the cable lifts back in without worrying about having a compensatory strategy. So again, when you think about strategies, we need a dynamic ISA to make sure that we've got our availability of that full diaphragm excursion, so we can now get an effective exhalation and a normal inhalation without any compensatory strategies. So Mihail, I hope that gives you a little bit of strategy, a little bit of understanding. Just make sure that as you go through these activities that you can breathe through the entire activity. If there's a breath hold involved there, you're going to have to use some form of compensatory strategy. Everybody have a great Monday, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Happy Batman Day.